Of course it can spoil the farm for you. This horror movie's literally about a couple that gets captured and treated like farm animals. The farm full spoilers. Here we go. The movie starts off with this LA couple, Nora and Alec, traveling to the countryside. Nora needs to use the restroom, so they stop at a rest stop. And Nora finds a lost cell phone and wallet on the ground before using the restroom in the open. The camera then shows a human noggin nearby that Nora failed to see. Nora tells Alec about the belongings that she found, but he doesn't care because he's running low on gas. Along the way, they meet this random woman who needs help because her car is broken down. While Alec tries to fix her car, the woman starts roasting Nora because Alec hasn't put a ring on it yet. Nora gets offended because she thinks her marital status is none of the woman's business. They get in a little argument and ditch the woman, who insults Alec for not being able to fix her car before they leave. The couple then stops at a diner to grab some burgers that apparently tasted really bad when Alec notices a man staring at Nora. As they leave the diner, this man tells Nora that she's not safe here. The couple then drives to a gas station and asks this employee if there's any nearby cabins that they could stay at. He directs them to a nearby rundown cabin that's owned by this crooked-faced landlord. Despite the couple thinking that that guy's really weird, they have to crash here because there's nowhere else. That night, it shows a stranger lying underneath their bed. The stranger is wearing an animal mask and stands over the couple as they sleep. The next morning, Nora wakes up in a cage outside. A man in a goat mask pops up and starts banging on the cage. Nora tries to break the lock using a rock, but then a man in a cow mask shows up and puts her to sleep. Nora wakes up in a barn stuck in a chair as people in animal masks force some toaster strudel icing into Nora using a syringe. It wasn't actually toaster strudel icing. She gets put back in her cage and witnesses many other people in animal masks unaliving humans in the same way you would do so for an animal that's going to be sold in the freezer section of a grocery store. It then shows her partner Alec being held in a cage with other men in the same situation as him. The masked men proceed to bonk the other men in their noggins and take them on a cart for further processing. It's then revealed that this whole operation is an organization run by the landlord that sells their goods for catering services and weddings. They sell meat and dairy. One is provided by the men and the other provided by the woman. The organization receives a big order, but they don't have enough supply for the demand. The employees make their way to the dairy barn to choose one of the women to unalive. They catch the woman feeding her child and unalive them right in front of her. Meanwhile, Nora talks to other victims alongside her, one of them being Ashley, who's been there for 3 years, as Nora tells her that they'll escape. Alec then knocks on the door of Nora's stable, revealing that he escaped, and they both run away with each other. They find a truck, but it doesn't start, so they make their way on foot. They find an empty church where the faces of Jesus have been replaced by animal masks. This man in a cow mask shows up and chases them outside. Alec ends up getting caught in a trap, and Nora has to abandon him as he becomes unalived by the masked people. Nora finds a male victim that tells her about a bus and keys that she can find inside of a house. Nora bonks one of the masked people, putting them to sleep, as she escapes using his car, but she runs out of gas. She runs back to the stables and releases Ashley to escape with her. They find a residential house, and the keys are there just like the man said. They run to the nearby bus and use the keys to start the bus, but Ashley looks horrified and Nora doesn't know why, so she looks behind her and sees that the bus is full of masked people. Then it shows the masked people fine dining on Nora and Ashley. The end.
While we're talking about frogging, let's talk about celebrities who had stalkers fully move into their house without them knowing. And a reminder that if you're interested in these stories, this week's episode is going to terrify you. Jennifer Lopez once had a stalker break into her pool house and live there for 6 days. And if that didn't fuel your nightmares enough, here's a photo of him. He kept taking all of these weird photos inside of the pool house and posting them online, and he was writing notes and stuff about them being married. And the same sort of thing also happened to Pamela Anderson once. In 2001, she noticed that some of her clothing and some of the food in her kitchen had gone missing. And then one night when she came home with her son, she noticed that there was a woman's face in the window of her home. She ran inside and found that there was a woman there who had been there for 3 days. And the woman was wearing her iconic red Baywatch swimsuit. She was also holding this note that mentioned how much she wanted to touch Pamela Anderson. And then, of course, there is the very bizarre story of what singer George Michael went through. One night, George was home with just another friend in his house. They were sitting on the couch chatting when he thought he heard the sound of his name being called from underneath the floorboards. And it turned out that a few days prior, a woman had crawled under the floorboard and had been living there.
Morbid Facts, Part 378. In May of 2020, UConn student Peter Manfredonia was having issues with his motorcycle. When 2 elderly gentlemen approached to help him, Peter pulled out a samurai sword and murdered one man while seriously injuring the other. He then circled around them multiple times with his bike before stealing another man's pickup truck and fleeing to his hometown. That's when he murdered his childhood friend and kidnapped the victim's girlfriend before driving south. Once he reached New Jersey, he fled the car alone and started walking on foot. Manfredonia's actions quickly sparked a massive manhunt that spanned multiple states and garnered national attention. However, it became increasingly difficult to locate the killer since this was during the peak of the pandemic, allowing him to easily conceal his face with a mask. After a week-long search, Peter was finally apprehended in Maryland. He was later diagnosed with multiple mental illnesses that caused him to suddenly snap. He received a 55-year prison sentence for his crimes and then apparently gained 200 pounds while in prison.
Let's rank each trap in Saw X from least brutal to most brutal. Spoilers ahead, obviously. Even though she deserves her trap the most, Cecilia's trap by far is the least brutal of the movie. Her test involves a gas that is eating away at her skin, but all she has to do is sacrifice her boyfriend to survive, which doesn't seem to be that hard for her to do anyway. Y'all are gonna yell at me for this, but the second least brutal is the eye suction trap. In order to escape, he has to break 5 of his fingers, which I'm not underestimating that. I've had trauma to my hands before. I know how bad that is. There's a lot of nerve endings in your hands, but I feel like compared to the rest of them, this is pretty easy. Then we're gonna go for the blood boarding trap. Obviously, John and Amanda know how to get out of this, but anything that simulates drowning, a big no-no for me. The radiation machine is insane, incredibly brutal. Breaking your own bones like this while your face is being fried, intense. Next is Diego's trap with having to slice off his skin. Brain surgery is in second for me. Blood marrow is by far the worst.
Breaking news, grand jury documents now reveal that the 2 surviving roommates were texting each other during the entire crime. This newly released information comes from the father of Kaylee. He received this information from an individual who served on the grand jury. In the original documents for the crime, it stated that the 2 surviving roommates were sleeping. However, it has now been revealed not only were they not sleeping, but they were texting each other methodically from room to room during the crime. Kaylee's father found the person who could explain the reason for this, but he was stopped from contacting them by the FBI. The witness had originally reached out to authorities through a tip line and was promised protection of their identity for volunteering the information. Kaylee's father was then warned about the legal consequences regarding tampering with a government witness. I'll keep you guys updated. What do you think? Drop in the comments.
While we're talking about frogging, let's talk about celebrities who had stalkers fully move into their house without them knowing. And a reminder that if you're interested in these stories, this week's episode is going to terrify you. Jennifer Lopez once had a stalker break into her pool house and live there for 6 days. And if that didn't fuel your nightmares enough, here's a photo of him. He kept taking all of these weird photos inside of the pool house and posting them online, and he was writing notes and stuff about them being married. And the same sort of thing also happened to Pamela Anderson once. In 2001, she noticed that some of her clothing and some of the food in her kitchen had gone missing. And then one night when she came home with her son, she noticed that there was a woman's face in the window of her home. She ran inside and found that there was a woman there who had been there for 3 days. And the woman was wearing her iconic red Baywatch swimsuit. She was also holding this note that mentioned how much she wanted to touch Pamela Anderson. And then, of course, there is the very bizarre story of what singer George Michael went through. One night, George was home with just another friend in his house. They were sitting on the couch chatting when he thought he heard the sound of his name being called from underneath the floorboards. And it turned out that a few days prior, a woman had crawled under the floorboard and had been living there.
Breaking news, Gabby and Brian's parents were in the same courtroom today for the first time. These depositions took place behind a closed door today. However, they will play a major role in the trial, which is set for May of 2024. Today, the legal team for Petito's parents disposed Christopher Laundrie. Gabby's parents described Christopher Laundrie's testimony as, quote, gut-wrenching. They said, quote, it was extremely hurtful to listen to someone that has no remorse and no compassion for the girl they would call their daughter-in-law. I'll keep you guys updated. What do you think? Drop in the comments.
Here's a question. If you had to choose another region of the world to live in or another time in history, which would you choose and why?
Oh, I'm going to do both.
Okay.
1930s Germany. No, I'm kidding. I would do, oh man, I've always wanted to live like somewhere safe, but like back when it's really dangerous. So I don't know where that would be. I want to like live in the old Western country, old saloon type of days, red dirt
Like
roads.
Old West?
Dude, old West, like, but true country style.
Somewhere like Wyoming,
The Sunshine State.
like Buffalo Bill.
Yeah, where the buffaloes roam.
Drink your sarsaparilla.
Is that the 1800s?
A region.
Yeah.
Yeah.
1850. 1850, Phoenix, Arizona. I'm sure there was like cowboys there, right?
But that's the time where if you got diarrhea, you die.
Oh yeah.
These are some morbid facts about the Holocaust that they'll never teach you in school. Gay male concentration camp prisoners were given an upside-down pink triangle to signify their homosexuality. Because of this, many of them were still considered criminals after being rescued and were often sent back to prison to serve out their terms. Many Holocaust survivors were too weak to digest food after being rescued. As a result, half of the survivors from Auschwitz died within a few days of being liberated. Towards the end of the war, future President Dwight Eisenhower predicted that people would try to deny that the Holocaust ever happened. So he ordered his men to take as many graphic photos as possible to prevent this from happening. Before World War II, a gentleman named Janusz Korczak ran an orphanage in Warsaw. During the Holocaust, Nazi soldiers came to his orphanage to take all 192 children to an extermination camp. Korczak was offered his freedom but refused to abandon the children. Instead, he boarded the train with them and was never seen nor heard from again.
This TikToker killed her sister for seemingly no reason. Claire Miller was born in 2007 in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. She was born to a very stable household. Her parents were very loving and kind and did everything they could for their daughters. Claire seemed to be perfectly healthy, but her older sister Helen was born with cerebral palsy. And because of this, she had to use a wheelchair for a lot, if not most, activities. And Claire and her parents all had to take care of Helen frequently. But this didn't seem to slow the family down. In fact, it seemed like they were closer because of it, and they all loved each other very much. But Claire liked to spend a lot of time alone in her room, and in her room is where she would make a lot of her TikTok videos. TikTok has shut down her account, but she would make videos lip-singing to pop songs or reacting to anime, and she even featured her family in a lot of her videos. And over time, she would gain a small following of about 20,000 people. February 22nd of 2021 seemed to be a very normal night for the family. It was a Sunday evening, so they went to bed. All but Claire. She stayed up till about 1 a.m. and she snuck into her sister's room with a kitchen knife. It was with this kitchen knife that she stabbed her sister and then put a pillow over her face. This happened at about 1 a.m, and at 1:08 she called the police and said that she had just killed her sister. Police originally thought this was a hoax because when they showed up, Claire seemed perfectly normal, but upon closer examination, they saw blood all over her. The saddest part of all of this is that Claire and Helen's parents didn't know anything was going on until police came into their home. Claire was then taken into custody and charged with her sister's murder. During court proceedings, Claire would at first plead not guilty to the murder of her sister. But on March 10th of 2023, Claire would plead guilty to third-degree murder and be sentenced from 12.5 years to 40 years in prison. During all of this, she was found to be mentally ill, but not mentally disabled. Claire was just 14 years old, so it seems like maybe she felt not as taken care of as her older sister, or maybe she was just fed up of taking care of her older sister. I don't know what was going on, but it's absolutely tragic. And after she was arrested and charged with her sister's murder, she gained about 55,000 more followers before TikTok shut down her page. Now, it is shut down, but people have taken her videos and you can still find them online to this day. So, what are your thoughts on this case? Let me know down in the comments and follow for more true crime.
People have been arguing for centuries over which of the 7 deadly sins has caused the most pain and suffering of them all. Fortunately, just one of the sins fits this description perfectly. Compared to all the other sins, the sin I'm speaking of is simply superior in terms of destroying peace and causing wars all throughout history. As a matter of fact, this one sin is said to not just be the root of the 7 deadly sins, but rather the root of all sins on earth. Now you might be thinking, just what is this sin you speak so highly of? Some call it the sin of war. Others call it mankind's first sin. I simply like to call it the founding father of all sins, pride.
Morbid Facts, Part 371. In the case that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were left stranded on the moon, NASA planned on cutting off communication with them. They didn't want to record how the men chose to die, leaving them to either run out of oxygen or take their own lives with no further earthly contact. FDNY Ladder 3 was one of the first units to show up at the World Trade Center on 9/11. Its crew of 11 men sadly perished in the collapse of the North Tower, and now their truck is on display in the 9/11 Museum. In April of 2015, 28-year-old Shayna Sims gained access to a funeral home in Tulsa, Oklahoma. She pretended to be a makeup artist to access the body of Tabitha Lynch. Apparently, Shayna resented Lynch and suspected that her husband had been having an affair with her. So as payback, Sims decided to mutilate Lynch's body, cutting up her face and removing multiple organs and chunks of her hair. Court sentenced her to 16 years in prison for unlawfully removing a body part from a corpse.
This is One Man, One Ice Pick, one of the most messed up and sickening videos on the internet explained. The video that I'm about to explain is 11 minutes long and I beg you to never look it up. On the left is Luka Magnotta and on the right is Jung Lin. As the video begins, Jung Lin, the victim, is seen naked and tied to a bed with a blindfold on, while the killer Luka Magnotta is standing over him. The song True Faith by New Order is playing, and this video completely ruined the song for me. The video then jump cuts to Jung Lin lying motionless on the bed and a bedsheet is placed over his head. Luka then enters the camera holding an ice pick and begins stabbing the victim repeatedly in the chest and stomach for over 1 minute straight. Luka then grabs the camera and holds it as a POV shot and shows all the stab wounds around the victim's body. There's no blood at all, which somewhat feels more unsettling, and this is because the victim's throat was slit off camera. We know this because Luka lifts the bedsheet from the victim's head. Still shooting in a POV style, Luka takes a kitchen knife and begins slicing into the victim's flesh on his right thigh and right arm. Luka then focuses the camera on Jung Lin's body, showing the full extent and brutality of the situation. The video then jump cuts again and shows the victim's head, which at this point has been severed. Luka places the head in a black box and plays with the severed head's hair for a couple seconds. Once again, the video jump cuts and Luka has the camera in one hand and the knife in the other. He starts to cut off one of the victim's arms at the shoulder, beginning the process of dismembering the victim's limbs. Luka cuts into the flesh for a while until the arm is half dismembered. He then drags the knife along the victim's back, causing severely deep slashes. Another jump cut happens, and at this point we see both of the victim's arms have been completely dismembered. Luka then picks up one of the severed arms and begins using the hand to pleasure himself. This is absolutely sick. At this point we get another jump cut and the victim's right leg is completely dismembered and the left leg has been half dismembered. A close-up is then shown of the victim's stump and you see his femur bone surrounded by flesh. The body is then turned over on its side, lying on its stomach. Luka then starts humping Jung Lin's body. Again, another jump cut happens and it shows Luka cutting off a piece of the victim's butt with a fork and knife. It's not shown on camera, but he 100% eats it. Luka then takes a small puppy who I assume has been starved and places it next to Jung Lin's body, and it then begins eating his right leg stump. Finally, the video jump cuts again, showing Luka pleasuring himself with one of the victim's severed arms, and the video then concludes. This whole video and case is absolutely sickening, and it's a very hard one to wrap your head around. There is also a Netflix documentary called Don't F With Cats that explains this whole case. I beg you to never go searching for this video because you will regret it.
Yes, the bedroom trap was designed to actually work. In the context of the movie, the way this trap works is this guy right here is restrained to the bed. He's restrained by his wrists and his ankles. They're each connected to these chains on either corner of the bed, like this. And if he does not complete his task in time, these machines are going to start working and they're going to yank each one of his limbs off of his body. So what did they do? They actually built a machine that could do this, and they set it up with props. This is a dummy person right here, but what it would do once it activates, it actually does pull the chains and it pulls the prosthetic arms and legs away from the base. Here's a picture of it after it's activated. All they had to do now was construct a bed where the actor could lay flat on it and stick his limbs underneath the actual bed. So here they have some concave little areas where he can stick his legs and his arms. And then special effects makeup artists who already had an entire cast of the actor's body could make prosthetic fakes of the arms and legs and attach them to his shoulders and kneecaps. That way, the machine actually just rips off the prosthetics and it looks like his limbs are really gone.
The use of tooth extraction as a means of torture has roots dating back centuries. It was employed as a method to inflict pain and discomfort on individuals, often in situations of imprisonment, punishment, or abuse. One brutal method involved forcefully breaking the teeth of the victim. This was often done with crude instruments, causing immense pain and damage to the person's oral health. Torturers sometimes employed dental drills to bore into the teeth, exposing the sensitive nerves beneath the enamel. The most straightforward and agonizing approach was simply pulling teeth from the victim's mouth. One dark chapter in the history of tooth extraction involved its use in psychiatric institutions. Patients with a history of biting or self-harm were subjected to the extraction of their front teeth as a measure to prevent further harm. This practice was seen as a means of control, albeit a highly controversial and inhumane one.
Photos taken before disaster, Part 3. This photo taken in 2004 shows Deborah Garlick enjoying the island paradise of Phi Phi in Thailand. But soon afterwards, a massive tsunami struck the area, killing around 230,000 people in total. This was the last photo taken on Deborah's camera before she was tragically swept away by the wave. This peaceful photo of the New York City skyline was taken from the Manhattan Bridge around 8:30 a.m. on September 11, 2001. Just 16 minutes later, a plane would crash into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Here's a pic of volcanologist David A. Johnston 13 hours before he was killed by the eruption of Mount St. Helens in 1980. He was the first to report the eruption from an observation post 6 miles away, transmitting the message, "Vancouver, Vancouver, this is it," just before he was swept away by a lateral blast traveling at near supersonic speed. He'd spent the last several months of his life studying the volcano, and his alert likely saved thousands of lives.
So this is the case of Grace Mullane, a 21-year-old traveler. She wanted to travel to mad different places, and she would always keep her family posted and updated. And out of nowhere, on December 1st, she was meeting up with this guy. His name was Jesse Kempson. She had met this guy on Tinder. Basically, they met up in kind of like a mall type thing. It had bars, restaurants.
Somewhere to just hang out and
exactly.
vibe.
There's messages. At first, she's kind of a little skeptical about going to see him, but she ends up obviously going to see him. They eat at a restaurant there. She starts texting her friend like, "Oh, we click," and they go to a second spot, which is like kind of like a bar, a little more secluded, not really that much people, like Sky City. After they go back to his hotel, December 2nd comes, which is the next day, and it's Grace's 22nd birthday. Her family spams her, "Oh, happy birthday," and they get no response. The family automatically gets suspicious about it. They report it to the cops. They message the hostel, so they look for the footage, and they see her leave December 1st, the guy she met on Tinder. They find more CCTV footage. They trace it back to his hotel now. They see that they walk in. She never comes back out of the room, but he does the next day. He goes to a store. He buys a suitcase.
Oh gosh, no.
He comes back to the room. Then later on in the day, he buys cleaning supplies, telling the hotel staff, "I just spilled some wine in my room. I'm gonna just clean it up real fast." Nobody thought nothing of it, bro. They go back to the hotel. They ended up seeing infrared blood stains on the floor. As much as he was trying to clean it,
They could still see that shit.
they obviously bring him into interrogation. He first said that they separate ways, they parted ways, but now he's like, I remember going in the room, she was into that rough sex, she wanted me to choke her, she just ended up dying, and I didn't know what to do.
Billy the Puppet from the Saw franchise was just spotted on the news. What would you do if you just saw him riding around on his tricycle outside? Just watch this.
Construction is supposed to start next summer, but for now, the Regents have deferred their vote on budget and design for this project until they can discuss it further at the next meeting scheduled in November. For now, reporting live in Westwood, Kimberly Chang, KTLA 5 News.
The study shows that most Americans don't.
It looks like some marketing for the new Saw X movie coming out this Friday. I saw the new trap scene that was released, where your eyes are connected to these tubes that act as a vacuum, and I'm pretty sure you can figure out what happens. Just as brutal as you'd expect it to be. The director said this movie will be a lot more simple and straightforward than expected, in a really good way, so if you haven't seen Saw in a while, you don't have to worry about catching up on all the lore. I can also spoil the first movie if you guys want to refresh your memory, just let me know in the comments.
I love to talk about dark Disney cover-ups, and one is happening as we speak. A woman is currently suing Disney for injuries she received on a water slide in the park in 2019. But all of the headlines are describing her injury as a serious wedgie, when in reality, this is what happened to her. I don't have to say it out loud, but her insides were coming out of her when she got off that water slide. So this happened on the Humunga Cowabunga water slide. It's a 214-foot drop, and you go so fast that it's recommended you cross your legs because the force from the water can really mess up your nether area. And that's what this woman did, but at a certain point she became airbound and it caused her legs to uncross. When she came back down, the water supercharged into an area that water is not supposed to go. And when she stood up, she was gushing blood from internal injuries and had to be rushed to the hospital. But what does Disney want you to think happened? This woman got a wedgie and is trying to sue poor little innocent Disney for money. But this is my favorite part. The article also mentions other times that the park has tried to cover up serious injuries. So you can see here that in 2005, a teenage girl who claimed in a lawsuit she had a stroke on Disney World's Tower of Terror, and Disney wrote that she just fell ill. And there was also a time at Universal where a boy's foot was crushed on E.T.'s adventure, and they listed it as foot pain. Anyways, this is your daily dose of media literacy.
This is one of the darkest stories from London's history. This is the Pool of London, and originally it was the stretch of the Thames along Billingsgate on the south side of the city, and it was home to ships containing exotic produce, as well as boats full of immigrants ready to start a new life. As Britain's empire expanded, this pool actually became the busiest section of river in the world. But before it became the hub of the Industrial Revolution, it was the location of one of the most devastating legends of London's history. It's said that in the 1600s, when the plague struck the city, people were desperate to escape. To get away from the illness ravaging the streets, they began hiring skippers to take them out of the city to avoid contagion. A group of Jewish people were cruelly tricked and rowed out here to the Pool of London instead of out of the city, where they were taken advantage of by their skipper, who demanded extra money from them to take them the rest of the way. Money they did not have. The skipper then abandoned them on the bank, and as the tides rose, they slowly drowned in the waters of the Thames. It's said that when the river is at high tide, you can still hear the screams and cries of those left here to die.
Let's talk about arsenic poisoning, specifically the Humbug Sweet disaster of 1858.
So sugarcane does not grow in Britain. It all had to be imported into the country at quite the expense. It was such a luxury that at the time it was nicknamed white gold. With such expensive sugar tax, how did the humble British sweet maker cope? Well, they would cut it with cheaper ingredients, or daft. Daft was basically a mixture of powdered limestone or plaster of Paris. It wasn't nice, but it wasn't lethal or anything. Until Bradford. So Humbug Billy was a local sweet seller in Bradford. His real name was William Hardaker, and he, like most people in his profession, used daft when crafting his very popular peppermint humbugs. But one day the pharmacy in Shipley made a mistake and they mislabeled their stock. Unfortunately, daft looks very similar to arsenic trioxide, of which Billy's producer bought 12 pounds. His producer, James Appleton's batch that day contained 40 pounds of sugar and 12 pounds of arsenic. Enough arsenic that if swallowed could kill 2 people per humbug. And Humbug Billy sold his sweets from his stall that night, and 20 people died, and 200 were in critical condition. Everyone involved was charged with manslaughter, but not one person went to prison. Have a good day!
I am a time traveler from 2069. I'm Jeff Moore, and here is what will happen in the next 46 years. Watch until the end, and I will reveal something to prove I am not lying. In 2026, Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg will create an entire city underwater, and 10,000 people will live there. In 2035, the US government will invent a machine capable of teleporting a person across the entire Earth. At first, this new technology will have a lot of imperfections, and millions of people will pass away during teleportation. But by 2069, it will be perfected. People will stop using cars, boats, or planes, and will only travel using teleportation. In 2055, a conflict will emerge between Russia and the United States. Shortly after, China, France, and Germany will enter the conflict. From 2060 to 2065, many battles will take place in Eastern Europe. In 2075, the United States will successfully create a dinosaur in a laboratory.
Badasses of History, Part 16. Christopher Lee, the actor who played Saruman in The Lord of the Rings and Count Dooku in Star Wars, was related to Confederate General Robert E. Lee, was a flight lieutenant in the British Royal Air Force and killed multiple Nazis, climbed Mount Vesuvius 3 days before it erupted, tripped over a live bomb and survived, and released a death metal album at the age of 88. During World War II, French weightlifter Charles Rigoleau was jailed after punching a Nazi guard. He then broke out of the cell by bending the bars, allowed other prisoners to escape with him, and then beat the guard who jailed him. Lachman Gurung was a Gurkha soldier during World War II who once threw back 2 enemy grenades from his trench before the third one exploded in his hand. He then single-handedly defended his post for over 4 hours against 200 Japanese enemies, killing 31 soldiers using only his left hand. He ended up surviving and was awarded the Victoria Cross for his actions, the highest and rarest honor in the British Army. Morbid Facts, Part 370. In 2010, the teenage daughter of Michelle Kalina came across something horrifying in her mother's closet, the decomposed remains of 5 babies. Over the course of 14 years, Michelle gave birth to at least 5 children, ending their lives immediately after they were born. She was sentenced to between 20 and 40 years in prison. When Frank Zappa was a child, he always played with the mercury that his chemist father brought home from work. often covering his entire bedroom floor with the element. But childhood exposure to mercury is now known to cause prostate cancer as an adult, which Zappa would end up dying from at the age of 52. In 1978, over 2,000 students from Pennsylvania tried to set the world record for the largest game of tug-of-war. But instead, the 2,000-foot rope snapped, releasing several thousand pounds of stored energy. Nearly 200 students were wounded, 5 had their fingertips severed, and hundreds more received second-degree burns.
You're saying that UFO...
First chapter of Ezekiel. Go back and read it. You'll think you're on acid or something. And realize, too, it's the King James translation. He translated it from Aramaic, I believe. I'm sure somebody's going to correct me on that. I'm not a biblical philosopher. I just read it. Yeah, it's in there, and it talks about a visitor coming down. It describes the craft. It describes the landing gear. In some translations, like a traditional pad that comes out, like you've seen in the science fiction movies. I look at those stars in the sky, and those stars, the light left those stars before the time of Christ. And that is the vastness of God's great universe. And honestly, do you think we're the best that God can do?
This is all that remains from one of London's most notorious prisons. Marshalsea Prison housed all kinds of people between the 14th and 18th century, but it's infamous for its incarceration of London's debtors. As a profit-driven enterprise, conditions inside Marshalsea differed dramatically depending on the wealth of the prisoners. The more affluent debtors revelled in relative luxury. They had access to a bar, a shop, a restaurant, and crucially they were let out during the day, meaning they could earn money and pay off their debts. Meanwhile, the poorer prisoners were crammed together into small rooms, and even a modest debt could see them held there for years. And the longer they stayed in there, the more their prison fees accumulated, creating a vicious cycle of debt. Many prisoners would perish due to starvation, and the jailers were more than happy to use skull caps and thumbscrews to torture any prisoner who crossed them. Charles Dickens' father was among those incarcerated. This forced Charles to leave school and work at a factory to take care of his family, an event that influenced much of his writing. The prison closed in 1842 and was demolished a few decades later. Now all that remains is a single wall that you can still visit today, and, as Dickens said, you will stand among the crowding ghosts of many miserable years.